Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. We are so honored to have our speaker today. As I mentioned, she's a gem. It's been very difficult to book her during conference season because she's a
Mm.
much sought after speaker. And thank you so much for everything. But as you know, before we start, because we only have an hour, I want to hand you over straight to Joanne. Please say hello to everyone in the community. Tell us where you are and tell us what the weather is like. I'm Maria. I'm the IM Technology Chair of IRMS. I'm in Aberdeen and it's a bit gray. I am so jealous, Ren. You're in sunny Bath, and Pete Wadley is in Fife in Scotland. And we're not wasting any more time. I am handing you over to Joanne.
Awesome. Good morning. Make sure everybody can hear me. Can you give me a thumbs up or just a response back? Um, I should say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining from. I'm thrilled that I'm speaking to such a varied audience around the globe, really. A testament to, I think, this interesting topic. I've actually never heard anyone do a whole session on the principles of retention. So I'm pretty excited to talk about this. And hopefully, this is the first time I've given this presentation. And hopefully you like the approach I'm taking. And I would love your feedback on the approach. My name is Joanne Klein, and I am from Western Canada, a province called Saskatchewan, and I'm an independent consultant, and I focus in on the Microsoft 365 compliance features, of which information governance and records management are two key ones that I hone in on there. I blog a lot at joannecklein.com, and you can also reach out to me via email, and that is my Twitter account. And I'm on LinkedIn as well. So I want to give you a little bit about my work experience and why I'm standing in front of you today. Feel like I'm fairly well-versed in this topic. And I spend a lot of time in these advanced compliance features in Microsoft. I have lots of experience, particularly in SharePoint. I come from the on-prem world, and now I'm exclusively online and even delve into that new awesome feature, SharePoint Syntax. And I have global industry client compliance, experience across many industry verticals. Just wanted to share that with you. My approach, and one you may or may not agree with, but with customers that I work with, the crawl, walk, run is a proven, established approach that I've seen quite a bit of success with. Perfect is the enemy of good, and so my approach usually is let's move the needle a bit. Let's aim for progress, not perfection, which is often a roadblock I run into on records management. And this is a marathon, not a sprint. You're not going to figure this out in a month and then move on to the next thing. You're in this for the long haul. Lots of planning goes into your policy and label configuration and setup in your environment. Absolutely. That's the, I guess, reason why we need to understand, a few key things, particularly these principles of retention. Really important that you understand your compliance obligations, whether they be legal, regulatory, or just business obligations that you have. That's fundamental and key. And what is the cost benefit of your compliance decisions? Are you have E3 now and trying to figure out, do we need E5? What if you don't go to E5, what is that costing you? What's the cost benefit? Really important to pull that thread and dig into there and understand what those benefits and costs are. And generally speaking, don't customize anything unless it's functionality you can't live without or it's a differentiator for your business. Anytime you customize anything, it brings on technical debt. The Microsoft 365 system changes a lot. So that's, you need to tread very carefully in that area. So today, this is what I'm going to cover. Why the principles of retention are necessary. And the second bullet point there is super important, and that is you can't just jump into the principles of retention without having a really good authoritative understanding of all of the kind of pieces, parts in the back end that help configure your retention policies and labels. You have many decisions to make, all with pros and cons and consequences, and they show themselves when the principles of retention kick in. Then we'll talk about the principles, and I've got 8 examples that we'll walk through for figuring out what happens with a piece of content once it's gone through those principles. So hopefully, oh, no slides yet. Oh my gosh. I'm so sorry. Okay, I'm sorry about that, everybody. This is the agenda. I'm just going to, please feel free to interrupt me if you don't see my slides going forward at this point in time. We only have an hour today, lots of material to go through. Okay, so I said this before, I cannot stress it enough. You need an authoritative understanding of what your requirements are before you even begin. Of course, this is dependent on where you are in the world, what industry you're in, maybe, you know, regional requirements, all kinds of regulations exist out there, and you need to be compliant with them. So this is going to depend on, you know, everybody in the audience here probably has, you know, variety of regulations you need to adhere to. That's thing one. Typically, the records managers, anybody in that compliance space has a good handle on this. Not so much the IT admins that may be helping you configure this. So, you know, you have to have a bit of the meeting of the minds between those two groups to have that base level understanding. The principles are necessary because they work alongside the retention policies and the labels that you have defined in your environment, and they are really the technical implementation of your requirements that you decide on, and they determine what happens to a specific item, be it a document, a video, an email, a chat. Okay, it determines when that is, how long it's kept for, and when it's deleted. So super important. So they basically ensure your rules are being adhered to at the end of the day. If an auditor comes in and, you know, you need to show that you're disposing of content when you say you are, it's these principles of retention that are performing the technical implementation of that. And as well, they take into account legal holds, which really is the one rule to rule them all. It overrides absolutely everything, and you know, will retain everything until that legal hold is removed on the location that you have it published to. So the essentials to understand before we get into the principles of retention. I have thought long and hard about this, and there are 5 things that you should really understand before you start configuring policies, configuring labels, and then worrying about the principles of retention. The principles of retention are there to honor the configuration settings you've aligned with and have configured for your policies and your labels. So if you start trying to understand the principles of retention without having a good, strong, fundamental understanding of the first 5 things, you're probably going to get confused, and you know, may not really understand what the true implications are of some of those principles. So I'm going to talk about this, not a lot, I'm not sure what the experience level is in the audience and if you're already familiar with this, so I'm not going to belabor these, but I just want to point out, if you're just getting into this space within Microsoft 365, really important to have a good handle on these essentials. So 3 actions that policies and labels can take. They can retain only. So there doesn't necessarily have to be a deletion component with a retention policy or a retention label. It can retain and then delete, which is most common. So I have an example there of a contract. Typically, you need to expire or delete something after it's been retained for a certain period of time. Optionally, a review is required. In regulated organizations, typically most content, if not all content, needs to be reviewed before disposed of. And not so obvious is a retention policy and a retention label don't have to retain at all. This is why I bring up this point, because unless you're really familiar with this, you may not realize that. An example I see often is retention policy to delete Teams chats 2 years after they're sent. So it's not called a deletion policy, it's still called a retention policy. And that's why understanding the action taken is really important. Because if you're assuming a retention policy always retains, that's incorrect. That's not true. You have to understand what the configuration settings are for that retention policy. Same holds for a retention label. Although I've never seen a retention label used in a real customer situation that only deletes, but you certainly can set it up that way. That's why when you're looking at the principles of retention, you need to know all of the retention labels and all of the retention policies that are published to a specific location, and then the items within what these settings are. This drives many, many things. All right, there are differences between a retention policy and a retention label. The principles of retention refer to both policies and labels. So important to understand the difference when you're deciding which one you want to do. And both can be published to the same location and in effect for the same item. That's why this is important to understand the differences. Retention policy is a container or a location-based construct. So it can be published to a SharePoint site, a Microsoft 365 group, an Exchange mailbox, one, some, or all. Retention label, very different construct at an item level, be it an Exchange email or a file inside of a SharePoint site. By and large, on the retention policy side, end user is unaware it's there. There's a few nuances in the UI some end users may pick up on, but by and large, it's meant to work seamlessly behind the scenes. An end user can still add, change, and delete content, and it doesn't affect that collaborative experience. A retention label side, this is right in the UI. An end user can see it, they can set it. Depending on the type of label, they can remove it. And the only time that they maybe can't see it in the side panel is if it's just been auto-applied and there's no other labels published to that site. Big difference, particularly for regulated organizations, is you cannot trigger disposition review on the policy side. You can with a retention label. Oftentimes, that's a big deciding factor of which of these constructs you want to do. You cannot declare content a record or regulatory record in a policy. That is a type of label, and I'm getting to a slide, a few slides down on the different types of label. They can start on different types of dates, and they are published to different locations. So you can see they're not a one-to-one comparison. There's nuanced differences between the two. I would say the overarching difference is location-based versus to a specific item. That's the biggest differentiator between them. That and disposition review, probably. Publish locations, different locations completely. So retention policy, you can publish at these location levels. I often see a retention policy for Teams chats if organizations want to get rid of them after a fairly short period of time. Many organizations consider Teams chat a liability. Depends on the organization. There's a cost to deleting them, of course, on the productivity side. On the retention label side, one thing you will notice, today you cannot publish or rather assign a retention label to a specific Teams chat or a channel message. Okay, so I'm going to just sit on this slide for a bit. Microsoft has documented this as well, and I have that in the slide notes. As you go from left to right on this table, the immutability of the item that the label is applied to increases. And you can see basically by the number of X's that are on each of the different label types, you can see the immutability increasing. Somebody's asking, where would just marking something a record fit? I'm not sure what context you're doing for that. You would use either a regular record or a regulatory record label. Typically, you would have something in your file plan that would dictate something needs to be a record. It has a degree of immutability required, and then you would apply it to a particular item. And I will soon talk about ways you can apply that. So it's part of your overall record strategy on where you're going to use a record label, what Microsoft calls a record label, versus just a regular retention label.
Joanne,
yes,
I have 2 questions on the questions tab.
Okay.
Just firing it because you're on the questions. Jenny Sinclair, would Joanne recommend Microsoft E5 licenses for retention and records management, or are third-party products at AvePoint a better alternative? That's one. And the second one is from Catherine Hiley. Do you think that Microsoft will eventually allow triggering of disposition reviews using retention policies?
Okay, first question is, I'm not going to lie, all of the automation capability and some of the new features coming, adaptive scopes is one of them, does require an advanced set of licensing. So do I recommend it? I mean, it depends on your organization. Anytime you can automate any of these retention capabilities versus relying on an end user to manually do it, you're of course in a better position. So yeah, my recommendation would be try to bring in those automated capabilities as much as you can. And I don't have any experience with the AvePoint product, so I can't speak to that. Generally speaking, about third party though, I would make sure you're challenging the cost benefit decision there on what is it going to cost you to bring in that third party product versus going to E5 or one of the advanced compliance SKUs. Make sure you're doing a fair comparison there. How is that going to impact the end users and the way they work with the data? It's a complicated decision, and it's much more than just dollars and cents. But on the dollars and cents side, make sure you're comparing apples and apples there. And the second question was, do I think there's going to be a disposition review on the retention policy? I have no insight into what the product group is thinking there. My gut tells me it will always be associated with just a retention label, but I do not speak for the product group in that regard, but I'll be a bit flippant about this. I wouldn't count on that changing anytime soon. Can you apply a retention policy at a document library level? Okay, I should have brought this up at the beginning. names are important. And what I often discover when I'm talking to people is they interchange retention policy, retention label, label policy terms. So, and they're different. So retention policy, if we're talking about the container level retention policy versus a label published to a SharePoint site, no, you cannot exclusively have it targeted to just a document library on a site. It's going to cover everything that's in that site. However, a retention label published through a label policy can be defaulted at a library level on a SharePoint site. So you could have multiple libraries on a SharePoint site. Each of those libraries could be defaulted with a different retention label. Okay, so we'll move on from this. I mean, there's a lot of detail on this slide. You're welcome, Lisa. But really important to know. There is a change coming that it's important to know about, and that is when you delete an item that has a retention label on it with the retain component in the configuration, because you can always delete a document or an item prior to at any time if all there is a delete component in the definition. Okay, it's just if you have something that has just a delete component, all it's saying is we'll make sure we'll delete it after this point in time if there's no retention component. Microsoft is going to be rolling out in November 2021 a change where if you have a retention label applied to a document, you will no longer get that message you see on the bottom right. Now it prevents you from deleting that. Soon it will allow you to delete it, but it will store that in the preservation hold library, a hidden library on the SharePoint site. So if you like this behavior and you want to stop an end user from deleting it, you can still do that. This will be a tenant-wide setting. So records managers, make sure you understand the end user, I guess, experience that you really want for your end users when they're working with your records, and whether you want them to see this error message or if you want to let them delete it so nobody can see it in the library anymore, but it gets still retained in the preservation hold library. So I just wanted to point that out. This is key when you're talking about your records. Okay, here's all the ways to apply a retention label. This is where the licensing discussion is critical. Anything on the top half of that box on the left, the automatically apply based on, is based on an advanced license. So it could be E5 or one of the advanced compliance SKUs. We're talking about a retention label here. So anytime you don't want the end user to have to worry about it, you can automatically apply it through any of these means, but it does require that advanced license. That's why you really need to understand this capability and make that judgment call between this and possibly bringing in a third-party product if you don't want to rely completely on the manual option. You can always do manual options, so you can do both, and often that's kind of the sweet spot to hit. And then once the label is applied, on the left-hand side, the way you've defined the label, all of those settings come into play and feed into that principles of retention that works for that one item. In this case, in this diagram, I'm showing a document. So for a specific document in a specific SharePoint site, the principles of retention run at an item level, and it will take all of these settings into account and figure out how long it needs to retain it for, and at what point can it delete it. All right, ways to scope retention. So this is a fairly new capability. I'm going to introduce a term called static scope, and it's a new term, one that Microsoft hasn't used up till now, but it's the way we've scoped retention policies and retention labels up till now. And I've inserted the word static because there's a new way of scoping, and this is just a way of differentiating the two types of scopes. So when you publish a retention policy or labels in a label policy, you had some options. You could pick all locations. So for example, all OneDrives, or you could pick certain ones, maybe all executive OneDrives, or you could exclude certain ones. So everyone but the executive, if you wanted to have an inverse type of, policy in place. So that was called static scope, and that's what we use today. The I guess the limits that static scopes currently have could be a problem for some large organizations. For instance, there's only 1,000 mailboxes that can be in one policy. There's only 100 SharePoint sites or 100 OneDrive sites that can be specifically included or specifically excluded from one policy. So you could certainly get around this by having multiple policies, but it becomes a governance and maintenance decision and task then for those that are responsible for configuring the retention policies and label policies in the back end. So worked with several customers that are in that scenario, and there is a way around it, and some have gotten quite clever in doing some PowerShell scripting to automatically create a new policy once you've kind of reached that limit. But it's not a trivial task to do that. And so Microsoft introduced something called adaptive scope. So there's the static scope versus adaptive scope. So I want you to be clear on the differences between these. Both retention labels and a retention policy can use a scope in either one of these scopes. This is currently in private preview. So, the functionality may change a little bit, but it's fairly well baked right now, and I've been testing with it, and it works awesome. And it allows for inclusion and exclusion of these locations I was talking about, but in a much more dynamic manner. And you can have these scopes there's 3 different types of scopes. One is a user scope, and it's based on Azure AD attributes, and I've got them listed there, or any filterable property. Example, I want to apply this retention policy to all execs and then list all the job titles for the executives in your company. Another type of adaptive scope is a Microsoft 365 group. There again, based on an Azure AD attribute. And last but certainly not least is SharePoint sites. So there's some extra work and knowledge that has to come into play on this on SharePoint and the search schema and how that works. But if you have that experience and that knowledge in your environment, and or you want to dig in and figure out how to do that, a great way for you to kind of marry the retention aspect into some of your site provisioning feature or tools you may be using today. So scopes in and of themselves don't really do anything. You're just constantly, dynamically including and excluding users, groups, or sites in the scope as attributes change. But you use the scopes in retention policies and label policies, which is where the real power comes in. So is there a question?
I've got 2, Joanne, from Mears. Would you recommend introducing manually applying labels as baby steps for an organization? Is the first question. The second question is from Camel Thornton. For public sector, labor start timings are limited. Do you know if they are looking to expand these options? Example is when case is closed.
Okay, I'll answer the first question. I might have to get a follow-up on the second one. First question was, yes, manually applying retention labels. Yes, that's a great place to start. And I would even say start doing that on some select sites and get feedback from end users working in there. How do they find it? Are they remembering to do it? Do they understand your label taxonomy? Another key thing, by the way, is records managers, and when they build their file plan, really important to come up with retention labels that are going to make sense for end users, particularly if you're relying on them to manually set them, for them to peruse down the list to pick which label to apply. The second question, I have to ask it again. I'm sensing it's for case management, but
yeah, and that's how the filtering would be, is the timing, which is in this case when a case is closed. So probably one of the criteria on the Camo, would you like to explain that a bit better to Joanne? Expand on it a bit. Okay, he's typing, and then we'll just wait for his note.
Okay, my general comment about case file management, all up in which is typically in SharePoint, is first of all, records management and the disposition review process does not work at a case level. And I know many records managers kind of expect that capability. However, there's several ways that you can default a case and all of the content within to have a retention label. And then you could have an event-based retention label that you determine when that case is done, that kicks off the retention period. There's a few other options you could do. It depends how many pieces of content are in your cases. Do you want to organize them by folder, by library, those kinds of things?
Yeah, Catherine did mention that might be about could be an event-based retention as well.
Yes, event-based retention is often what I see with case file management. That is an advanced compliance feature. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the use cases for adaptive scope. I've just got some examples here. You likely can think of an example in your own organization where you kind of selectively want to apply a retention requirement to certain people in your organization. Executive is a great example of this. Capstone email, if you have any requirement to deal with capstone officials and their unique retention requirements, great use case for adaptive scopes. Geography, and then the last one is on the SharePoint side. Maybe you provision a new project site or a new legal matter site for every case or every project, and you want all of the content within it to start its retention period when the status, let's say, of the project site or the legal matter changes. So that is much easier to do with adaptive scopes. Sorry. All right, so that's all well and fine. So we've talked about these, what I call essentials, my term, not Microsoft's, on using these to help inform what retention labels you define and what policies you define and how you're configuring that in the back end. Once you do that, then the principles of retention kicks in. This is what determines the action, the specific retain or delete action that's taken on each item, each mailbox item, each file in a SharePoint site or on a OneDrive site. So this is where you gain compliance. At the end of the day, if you need to keep something for 5 years and then delete it, the principles of retention are what guarantees you will in fact do that. You're not relying on, Mary in accounting to remember to delete those things 5 years from now, and she may or may not remember. Mary may leave. That's not a defensible process. So that's where this is going. As long as you have the right configuration on your policies and your labels in advance of this, this will guarantee that. So finally, let's get into the principles of retention. Okay, so you've likely seen this. Docs.microsoft.com has recently, like within the last 6 months or last time, really honed in and updated their documentation on how the principles work. And I feel they did that because there was some confusion in the field on how these 4 levels or 4 rules work together. So they provided a lot more clarity on how the rules work together, and I linked to them in the presentation. So I would recommend you go there as well and really dig into that. So this is my explanation of the principles of retention. First off, you're going to notice the top 2 levels, level 1 and level 2, are really only talking about retention. You start at level 1, of course, work your way down. If you get to level 3, we're really only talking about deletion at that point in time. That's a huge, important thing to understand. So that's the first point I want to make. The next point I want to make is these levels go through what's called a tie-breaking comparison. So the first thing you need to do before you start this is, let's say we're on a SharePoint site. We need to understand and know all of the retention policies that are published to that location. And then what is the settings? Are they retaining? Are they deleting? Are they doing both? What are those durations? Then for a particular item, does it also have a retention label? Okay, so walk through your scenario at an item level with something that has the retention policies and a retention label. Then you start the comparison at level 1 and you work your way down. And at each level, if you have a clear winner, and by winner, I'm just going to do an example. Retention wins over deletion. So if we had 2 retention policies published to the same, no, I'll use a different example. A retention policy and a retention label published to the same site, and the retention policy was for a year, and the retention label was applied to a document, and it was for 6 months. Level 1, retention wins over deletion. Well, they're both retaining, so there's no clear winner at that. So we go on to level 2. Longest retention period wins. So because you've determined in advance what those retention periods are, the retention policy was for a year, the retention labels for 6 months, longest wins. So you stop, the retention policy is in effect. That piece of content, even though it has a label, will be retained for 1 year. So that's a fairly simple example, but that's how these principles work. I've heard from many people that if something has a retention label, it's considered explicit. So it would override what a retention policy does. That is not true. That is down at level 3. And a retention label is considered explicit. A retention policy just published to a location will be considered implicit. But you don't even get that far because the longest retention period wins. So go through all of your scenarios and you will soon kind of have a pretty good understanding of when content will be deleted and how long it needs to be retained for. All right, so I am going to walk through 8 examples of this and then give you the answer. So as you're thinking through these, come up with the answer in your head, and then I'll tell you what the answer is and what principle is basically in effect for the content on the site. And I would recommend you go through this with your own configuration in your own tenant as well. So example 1 is if we have a retention policy to retain content for 1 year. We have a retention label applied to some of the documents on that same SharePoint site, and it's set to retain for 2 years and then delete. Okay. Example 2 is the same kind of retention policy, but this time the retention label is applied with a shorter retention period. So it's set to retain for 6 months, then delete. So if we look at the life cycle of items in the location, for example 1, labeled documents would be retained for 2 years, then deleted because the longest retention period wins for those labeled items. And all other content, all other unlabeled content would be retained for 1 year, then deleted, because the retention policy is in effect for that. They don't have a label. You will be prevented from deleting labeled documents early. And, with that new change that Microsoft is bringing in, and depending on your default behavior you have set at the tenant level, end users may be able to delete it and it'll go to the preservation hold library, or they will get that error message. So the level that wins in the principles of retention for labeled documents, longest retention period wins. For all other documents that aren't labeled, the retention wins over deletion. So you can see the level that wins is at an item level. It's not at a site level, particularly if you have multiple retention policies and a label applied to the same location. On example two side, all documents, even the labeled documents, would be retained for 1 year, then deleted. And you're prevented from deleting labeled documents any earlier as well. Same kind of logic and same options available to you as example 1. So for all documents on the site, the longest retention period wins. So I don't know if this is how you thought it worked. I would be very interested to get your feedback on some of these examples, and if you find them helpful and or surprising. Deletion examples. Remember that a retention policy and a retention label can retain only, retain and delete, or delete only. Okay, so in these examples, we're just set up to delete. There's no retention component at all. So example 3 is a retention policy published to a site to delete content after 1 year. I sometimes see organizations do this for OneDrive sites, maybe not 1 year, it would be longer, but to try to keep that, I guess, that hoarding mentality that has kind of plagued many organizations from the shared network drive days, trying to curb that a little bit. And so maybe you delete content, if it hasn't been modified after 5 years, kind of thing. I often see that. On that same site, a retention label applied to some documents to delete earlier, so for 6 months. Example 4, similar retention policy, so delete that content after 1 year. Retention label applied to some documents to delete after 2 years. So one is shorter than the policy, one is the label is longer than the policy. So the life cycle of items are labeled documents would be deleted after 6 months. All other unlabeled content will be deleted after 1 year. Important to know, if all you have are deletion configurations in your policy and your labels, an end user can delete any document any earlier, which makes sense because there's no retention component configured in your policy or your label. The level that wins in this for labeled documents, this is where explicit wins over implicit. There is a label on a document. It overrides whatever the policy would be at the location level. For all unlabeled documents, the shortest deletion period wins, which in this case is 1 year. On example 4, labeled documents would be deleted after 2 years. All other content will be deleted after 1 year. End users can delete any document earlier. Same 2 rules apply. Because there's a retention label on a document, it's explicit, so it wins over implicit, and it would be automatically deleted after 2 years if it wasn't deleted earlier, just manually. Okay, this is combined, which is more typical of what you would see, retention and deletion components together. So example 5, retention policy published to a site to delete content after 1 year. Retention label applied to some documents on the same site to retain for 2 years, then delete. Example 6, I'm bringing in a legal hold. Legal hold may be for, an external litigation, internal investigation, many reasons you may want to put a legal hold on, let's say, a SharePoint site. But in addition to that, you've got a retention label applied to some documents on the same site to delete after 6 months. So what would happen there? On example 5, your labeled documents would be retained for 2 years, then deleted. All other content would be deleted after 1 year. So an end user can delete an unlabeled document earlier. They cannot delete a labeled document earlier, though. So labeled documents, retention wins over deletion. Okay, so that's level 1. That's what wins. You don't have to check any further. All other documents, there's just a deletion component, so the shortest deletion period wins. On the legal hold side, all content, whether it's labeled or not, is held until that legal hold is released. Legal hold is one rule to rule them all. It doesn't matter what you have in place on a SharePoint site or on an Exchange mailbox, all of the content will be held during, the whole time that legal hold is in effect. Really important to make sure, your legal team and your compliance team understands that piece. So in that case, the longest retention period wins. Once you lift the hold, then whatever other retention mechanisms you had published to the site will resume and take effect, which means depending on your settings, there may be a bunch of content that will get automatically deleted if you had any kind of a deletion component configured on that location whose period has expired. And the last two are example 1, Exchange. So retention policy published to all Exchange mailboxes to delete after a year. And then a separate retention policy published to just executive mailboxes to retain content for 10 years, then delete. This is where I would use an adaptive scope to, intelligently and dynamically define who is on your executive team. So that could include even temporary assignments. And I see these combinations of retention policies used in fairly large organizations. Example 8 is a retention policy published to all mailboxes to retain for a year, then delete. Retention label applied to some select mailbox items in there to delete after 6 months. So the life cycle on the example 7, all mailbox content will be deleted after 1 year, except for your exec mailboxes, which will be retained for 10 years, then deleted. So end users can delete their items earlier. Exec content, if they do it, is automatically preserved in a hidden location. Exchange Online works a little bit differently than the behavior in SharePoint Online. So this change that Microsoft is bringing in kind of brings those two environments in alignment on what you can do with the labeled item. Example 8 is all content, including the labeled items, are retained for a year and then deleted because retention wins over deletion. End users can delete any item earlier. So you can see the level that wins in the bottom. So I'm going to just sit on this slide. I did a whole big blog series on a fun challenge for the principles of retention, 6 different scenarios. I got you to, using Microsoft Forms, you could answer what you thought the end result would be for a particular item for labeled and unlabeled documents. So if you haven't checked that out, please feel free to go there and test your knowledge on how this works. So I'm going to leave this here for a minute and then dig into the questions.
And we've got a ton of them, Joanne.
Okay.
I was holding up because I know how important those examples are.
Yeah.
So let us start on the questions tab. You could look at the questions tab. The first one was from Kate Bolsover. Can adaptive scopes work at document library level or just site level in SharePoint?
Okay, I'm going to say it depends. You can use an adaptive scope in both a retention policy and a label policy. If you used it in a retention policy, that's at the entire site level. If, however, you use it in a library level, you could auto-apply a retention label with that, using that scope to key in on a specific document library if you wanted. So configured correctly, yes, you can. I would do an auto-apply label policy in combination with an adaptive scope.
Okay. And Jenny Sinclair says, is managing all these policies heavy on resource? Does it take constant management?
I would say it takes care and feeding to make sure there's quite a bit of collaboration that has to go on up front to align on what you're going to configure and what the settings are going to be. So that's an upfront piece of work. However, if you've aligned that with your regulatory, legal, and business requirements, that shouldn't be changing a lot. But where the work comes in is on the disposition review, on the auditing, are people changing the label? All of these activities are audited, and in the activity log, in the Activity Explorer rather, in the Compliance Center. So in that sense, yes, it requires some constant kind of monitoring and vigilance to make sure that your content is being, I guess, managed appropriately. So it's a new role, I would say, that's kind of morphing out of managing records in the modern workplace. Super important. And I would say that doesn't matter, no matter what tool you're using. That is a key success criteria, in my opinion.
Okay, and we've got Kevin. It seems that to enable disposition reviews, auditing needs to be turned on, which in turn needs an E5 license. I think those are two things. Those are two different things, the disposition review and the auditing. And please correct me, Joanne. Those are two functionalities that are available in different licenses.
Right. That's correct. If we just hone in on the auditing question, you don't need E5 to turn on auditing. There's advanced auditing that requires it, or you can, if you want to retain your audit log for longer than, I want to say 90 days, you can get advanced licensing. But it, in and of itself, you don't need E5 just to have auditing. It's just a feature you enable. Disposition review, although it relies on auditing, it is an advanced compliance feature. So just by getting an advanced compliance feature gives you the capability of doing a disposition review on a piece of content. I hope that answered your question.
And we've got George. George, I saw this on the chat. So George says, we tried using deletion-only retention policies, but it would still not let us delete before the end of the period set. Is this something new, or were we doing something wrong?
It should have let you delete it if there was absolutely no retention component. And I would pull that thread a little bit, make sure that's true. Or that there was no legal hold. As far as my testing and my observation has always been, is you could delete that earlier. I will say, in addition to the adaptive scopes, a feature that's coming is I think it's called a policy lookup. And what it'll allow you to do is put in a URL, let's say, of a SharePoint site, and it will tell you all of the policies in effect for that SharePoint site. Uber helpful in your exact scenario where it's not behaving like you think it should. Maybe there's something published to it. Particularly, you're going to see this in large environments where you've got a lot of policies in effect, and it's hard to know unless you dig into PowerShell or manually check each policy what's actually in effect for a specific site. So as far, the short answer is it should let you delete it. And if not, I would have to dig into the exact use case there.
And we've got James Rock. Hi, Joanne. What is your advice on applying a complex retention schedule consisting of a number of record types and trigger events to a SharePoint?
What is my advice for implementing that? Is that what that is?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Complex retention schedule. Yeah.
Okay. I would say start with knowledge. So what I taught, the essentials are imperative to know. So know the capability of the product. That's thing one. Know your obligations, which likely are sitting inside of your retention schedule, your record schedule. And depending on licensing, what features are available to do. There is a bit of a modernization, I would say, of records management going on now. And I know this is a well-established domain that's been around for a long time. However, there's some things that I think are really pushing that industry to try to move forward in this modern workplace and still manage their records in a defensible way. So one would be all of your retention labels. Do you need all of them? Can you parse them down to, the minimum that you need? I have seen many teams trying to do that, trying to make your retention requirements, what's the word? Able to be automated. Remove the vague language is a huge step. Things that you could have done in the paper-based world, much more challenging to do in the digital world where you have to put in the rules. Okay, so it's a meeting of the minds between the records management team and the IT administrators that need to kind of help you in some cases, maybe not, but in many cases I see help configure the back end. Simplify that record schedule as much as you can, keeping in mind your regulations are required, right? You can't not be compliant. I get that. But if there's opportunity to simplify it, do that if you can, then get that into the back end of the compliance center. If you have the license to do so, you can import it into the file plan, determine what's event-based, what are all your triggers for retention, and then dig into those events because they require a little bit of extra care and feeding on what's going to trigger that event, where are those records going to be across your tenant? Is it in a controlled manner? Or is it going to be willy-nilly all over? So some of this stuff speaks to your governance model inside your organization as well, which may kind of have to be in lockstep with your move forward. Crawl, walk, run. Again, it sounds trivial, and but I have seen organizations have success with that. Start simple if you can and kind of build on it. Like you may want to start with finance. I pick finance because typically finance teams are very comfortable working in structure. They work in fiscal year, fiscal quarter, fiscal months. That's a great way. So, getting them to maybe apply a retention label or defaulting a retention label every fiscal quarter, it is a fairly easy move, more so than maybe going over to marketing. Let's say that's just a silly example, but I have seen success in that regard. So I don't know if any of those tips were helpful. This is where consulting engagements really dig into a specific need of an organization, what's going to work for you. But those are some things I've seen success with.
Yes, and is an E3 license going to preclude us using much of this capability? Ooh, the licensing question.
Yeah, I'm not going to candy code it, but any of the automation, SharePoint syntax, and adaptive scopes will all require an advanced license of some sort. So the conversation you need to have, I guess, with the business decision makers in your organization is, what is the cost benefit of E3 versus advanced compliance features? And, compliance is expensive. Non-compliance is expensive. Neither option is cheap. Particularly, privacy legislation is coming into play, and lots of these features to protect, citizens' privacy are these same advanced compliance features. If you're holding on to information for too long, or if information gets leaked, that's expensive too. So it's a balanced conversation that needs to happen. It's a challenging situation. I get it, but automation equals advanced compliancing. That's kind of a general safe statement to make.
Okay, I'm not so sure if we missed anything. I'm looking through. There was a request for the links that you have in your presentation to be shared on the chat, but it won't. It will. You could go to Joanne's, because a number of the links are in her blog as well. That's what I've noted. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Do you
we will
share the
share.
presentation with the attendees?
Yes, we will share the presentation with the attendees, and of course,
Okay.
after this session, they will also get a chance to download the video as well. If you're an attendee, there's
Okay.
an automated message which would allow you to do that. You know where to contact Joanne. One of the good
Yeah.
things that we would say we have requested in the CAB as well for this functionality in retention is a dashboard from Microsoft to say, so that when we look at libraries, we know what's going on with the principles of retention. Now, we don't know when that is going to happen or if that is going to happen.
Yeah.
But I'm sure Joanne would be there to blog about it, and all of us as well in this space.
Awesome. Well, thank you for having me today. I would love your feedback, so you can either reach out to me via my blog or my contact information. I'm actually going to go back there now. If you have a question I did not answer today as well, ask, and I mean, I may turn it into a blog. So that would be helpful for me and maybe helpful for you.
Yes, and thank you very much, Joanne. From the feedback of everybody, it's been a really great and informative session. And thanks everyone for your continued support of our webinars. We hope we can continue to get you on board and share this knowledge that our esteemed people like Joanne Klein allows us to host for you. Thank you so much, Joanne.
Awesome.
And
thank you for having me. It was my pleasure to speak with this group today.
Thank you so much. And take care, everyone. Have a nice evening, day, morning.
Yeah.
And thank you. I see everyone. Thank you, Raymond, for staying. It's 11 o'clock in Asia.
Oh my goodness, that is dedication. That's awesome. Thanks for coming, everybody.
Thank you, guys. Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
I will send the presentation to you via email shortly, Maria.
Yes, thank you so much, Joanne. And what I'll do is I'll just stay on because I'm going to look through the chat and check if I've missed any questions, because there was a time when it was coming in fast and I was like, ooh, did I miss something?
Yeah. Okay. No, that's good. First time me giving the presentation, the timing I think was spot on.
It's spot on. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yet loads of folks think that was quite helpful. I like the examples because I've seen you do that in there as well.
Yeah.
So those examples helped me a lot before as well. So I knew they had to focus on it.
The only improvement I thought maybe I could make with them is, instead of just talking generically about a retention policy and retention label, if I had actual like retention policy set to retain whatever executive emails and make it a little bit more real. I did that on one of them, but I don't know if that would matter.
Yeah, that would be any improvements beyond that. But as it is, it's already, I mean, you've seen the feedback. It's already quite helpful.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah. All right. Well, I will.
Yeah, you can pop on stage, Ren.
Oh, yeah.
Of course you can. Hold on. Give me a second. Let me put you on stage.
Oh, I didn't realize you had to allow people. You had to pop people on stage.
No, they could actually. He's just being polite. Very British, Ren.
Oh, yeah.
Joanne, that was superb.
Oh, hi.
Hello. I love the use cases. I think that really engages, doesn't it?
Yes.
And that the way, all those different scenarios at the end. Just
okay, good. It's. I've never seen anybody present on this, and I thought, is there enough to fill 45 minutes or 50 minutes? But I guess there was.
30.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I was going to ask one question actually.
Yeah.
While we're here, the business that of fundamentally, if you want a disposition review at the moment, rather than argue it at length with Microsoft, it's really saying have a label strategy rather than a policy strategy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, is that what you're asking me?
Yes.
Yes. Yes. I mean, it's one of the key decision factors. And as a matter of fact, if you were to build a decision tree for organizations, that's question one you need to ask. Do you need to provide a disposition review on every single piece of content you get rid of?
Yeah.
Okay. And many will say yes, and many will say, well, not every piece. So that's where retention policies come into play. And but it's if you need it, then you're talking about a retention label. And my gut says that won't change anytime soon, but I'm not privy to all those conversations.
Yeah, via the cab and things like that. Is it something even worth arguing? Or perhaps we sort of say, because you can do it via labels and take that decision tree thinking that you eloquently described there, Joanne.
Yeah.
Perhaps it's a bit of a red herring.
Okay. Would your thought be that all of the individual, let's say it worked that way, a retention policy you could have a disposition review that at an item level still within that location where that retention policy is published to, they would all appear in the disposition review back end where retention labeled content goes today. Would that be in your ideal world? Is that what you'd like to see?
I'm not sure. I know some people would say they'd like the theoretical opportunity to have a disposition review to every single piece of content prior to it being deleted, to scan it even.
Yeah.
And at the moment, unless you somehow apply a label to every piece of content, that won't be possible. And I'm just thinking, is it a bit of theory we want to carry on arguing with the case for with Microsoft?
Yeah, I think so, because you never know what that might turn into. Is it that you need a disposition review? Or I've heard organizations say, I just want to know what's about to be deleted.
Yeah.
And there's no easy way to do that even right now. So would that be an acceptable middle ground? I don't know. So to your point, yes, I think it's worth bringing up.
Yeah. We're pursuing both lines of inquiry anyway. Will tell us what's happening. So we can take action, or we want disposition for everything. And we want aggregated disposition. Aggregated disposition is one of the things that we requested.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah. This is
where we may sorry, and this is me talking separately to these seminars that Maria organizes so wonderfully, but it's a bit of conversation Maria will be aware of. It's the thing I'm just sort of kicking around at the moment about white papers for our membership, and what I'm doing at the moment is building fundamentally a wish list of what people might want to read white papers on. And the more I think about it, the more I think use case based scenarios. How do you in Microsoft apply retention during personnel management processes, during construction project management processes? And once we've got that, we'll be reaching out to wonderful experts such as yourself to discuss.
Joanne has a number of them. I know Joanne has a number of them in finance and all that. See, I'm true to the fact that I do follow you, so I know that you have several on your blog, especially on the financial calendar.
On the finance, finance teams are my favorite. Yes, I think Microsoft is aware they need more scenario-based guidance all up across information governance and records management. So I think you're going to start to see more of that content coming from them, just because it's just easier to kind of relate it if it's not exactly like what you want, but at least, you can kind of translate it into your own world. That's super important. And that's, I always like to kind of go down that road as well. Give a real example.
Absolutely, because there was a nice comment in the chat today about how that's really helped clarify my thinking on GDPR in one of your scenarios where you can sort of label a small number of documents you really can't keep because of the personal data contained.
Yes.
But don't want to lose the rest, you know.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So it's kind of layering all of these requirements on top of each other. And, you know, it gets exceedingly difficult to kind of, you know, it's almost juggling these requirements. Okay, we got a private, you know, GDPR, and then we've got these executives over here, and we've got these 10 SharePoint sites, and like, you know, it becomes complex very quickly. But I think, you know, it's not rocket science. It's just, you got to know these things and how Microsoft has implemented them before you can even get into that world. You know, but
I'm not sure actually. Have we still got an audience, Maria, or are we talking private? Oh, right.
We still have an audience. I couldn't end it because we're going to be kicked out. It's a very good discussion, I have to say. I mean, pretty good insight as always, Joanne. We'll probably book Joanne a year ahead just to be sure.
No, it's not actually that I'm that busy. It just so happens that I just, for a little bit of time there, I just had conflicting things. So no, it's a pleasure to speak to this group. I'm not sure if we had combination of records management people, IT administrators. I kind of, I'm actually doing a blog post on the retention essentials for IT administrators, and a sister post, the retention essentials for records managers, because they're a little bit different. And I see so many organizations struggle with those two teams. I mean, IT admins, they know nothing generally about records management. It's just tell me what you want me to configure in the back end, and or I'll just slap this retention policy across all locations and there we're compliant. Are we compliant? Like, you know, there's way more to it. So trying to get down to the brass tacks, if you will, of what they need to dig into and understand, because, you know, there's no shortage of documentation on docs.microsoft.com. That's not the problem. It's just kind of honing in on what do I really need to understand to work in this world. Yeah.
Brilliant. And to those still listening, this is something that I alluded to earlier in this past few minutes that we're really going to be providing as a member resource is a focused, curated, I think that was your wonderful word, Maria, curated way to navigate to the best possible resources, including commissioning some membership only resources, and of course anything that arises in these kind of sessions that we can feed through in the Microsoft Customer Advisory Board straight to their development team will be doing.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to leave. So it was a pleasure to be here today. Thank you so much. And enjoy the rest of your day.
And you too. Take care. Have a
Bye-bye.
Bye.